Okay, here we are. In the fourth quarter of 1970, we had finally figured out how big the iceberg was. It was awesome. And we had just about used up the entire, I think it was a $100,000 study that was created by the trade organizations, passed on to the ad hoc committee, and became part of our contract. And I was given the unlikely task of going to visit with Mike O'Connor somewhere in that quarter and telling him they were essentially out of money. But the good news is we were going to continue because it was good, and we hoped that somehow we would be able to recoup whatever additional costs were going to be incurred. But we saw it coming. We saw this as a multi-million-dollar project that was only in the very early stages of solution. Now, another thing happened in the fourth quarter, and that was we got terrific support from RCA, in particular Riley Daniels, who was the effervescent salesman, and Fran Beck, the more restrained engineering guy, and there were many others. They took us into their secret laboratory. They showed us a working checkout scanning system. It was quite impressive. They even gave us their proprietary data on checker bagger productivity improvement. I can tell you now that the numbers that they presented, which seemed to be quite impressive, was about a 40 to 50% increase in checker bagger productivity. Remember now, checker bagger costs represented 25% of the gross margin of a chain. And so if you could increase the productivity by 50%, you were going to save a lot of money. There was also the opportunity, which we'll get into a little bit later, about other ancillary savings, but we'll leave that for now. When we went to Nielsen to get some supporting information to help us with the understanding of the nature of how many items and so forth, they essentially, because of their structure, were not able to help us at all. So no data, to my knowledge, was ever obtained from Nielsen. We did investigate the American National Standards Institute process because we thought that might be a way of short-circuiting the whole process. It turns out quite the opposite. The average ANSI standard took 13 years to develop and involved incredibly burdensome and complicated processing, which is, frankly, and was the standard for standards. But the grocery industry needed a quicker answer to avoid the possibility of somebody jumping the gun and trying to force a standard on the industry. So we said, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to be fact-based, we're going to be open, we're going to listen, and we're going to come back with recommendations that were open and transparent to the entire community. Now, we also, at that time, went to the industry executive responsible for the grocery industry. I honestly forget his name, but he was headquartered in White Plains. And he told me straight up, he said, look, we don't think you guys have a chance of coming up with a standard for checkout automation. So, you know, we'll be here, we'll answer questions, but we're really just not going to participate. Yeah, I guess it was John, yeah. So anyway, we said, all right, we'll be back. We know that you've got all sorts of things going on in your laboratories, and we obviously weren't looking for a fight, but that was the state of play in the fourth quarter of 1970. We went to visit NCR. We went to visit NCR. That was fascinating. These people were the giants of the checker cash register business. They had 95, 96% of the entire worldwide share of market. They had massive plants that were all dedicated to electromechanical devices. We saw no evidence of automation anywhere. In fact, the only automation that was going on was in computers in Japan. And I remember vividly when we got there, they treated us very well. I stayed in the Wright brothers' home, by the way, which they maintained. I even played golf at their private golf course, which was open to all employees, which is a nice perk. And I also had lunch in their executive dining room. Now, their executive dining room had a U-shaped table that seated about 150 executives, and everyone had an assigned seat in descending order from the chairman, who sat at the head of the table. And it was really a great lunch served by secretaries, a little bit outdated for the way things were going. But anyway, I have to say that NCR, and in particular Dick Midland, that we later met, were very gracious. They resisted the effort as long as they could, but they were always gracious and always willing to chip in and make comments and suggestions. We also got information from a company called Zellweger in Zurich, Switzerland, who was developing a scanner much like the RCA scanner. In this case, rather than a bullseye symbol that RCA used, the Zellweger people used a semicircular bullseye. And in fact, I'll come back to this later, we're going to run and did run in-store tests in a Migros supermarket in Switzerland. So anyway, back to my discussion with Mike O'Connor. Yep, we're out of money, Mike. He was not impressed. In fact, he was quite unhappy. But I said, look, that's the bad news. Here's the good news. We've already come to the conclusion that a code numbering system will provide the foundation for automation, and the code number should only be a social security number for each item. At this early stage, we had already concluded that it could not and should not include other data such as price, date, etc., but only should be a unique identifier. And that meant, however, that a check stand wouldn't work without an in-store computer, because the prices would have to be located in the in-store computer in what was then called, and still is, a lookup file. So that was an important conclusion that we reached very early. We also said that a code number without scanning probably was not sufficient. Now, there were others who disagreed, in fact disagreed rather strenuously with that. Vern Schatz, who was a senior executive at Juul and NCR, felt that electronic cash registers with key entry would be just as good and much cheaper. We were doubtful of that alternative, so we laid the groundwork for the project, first deriving a code number and then a machine-readable representation of that. This was all, by the way, all in the fourth quarter of 1970. And then we said that the keys to the kingdom were at the time thought to be bottom marking, that is, putting the symbol on the bottom of each container. And that we were dubious of, but we recognized that that was viewed by some, including RCA, as fundamentally important to the productivity gains. We later showed and proved that that was, in fact, not necessary. Then there was the issue, we concluded that the bullseye concept, where you had, in effect, a series of lines that encoded the code, were key to the RCA productivity, but not necessarily key to any and all scanning technologies. The other thing that's important to recognize is that the bullseye, the bigger the code number, the bigger the bullseye, and at some point you end up with a package label with just a bullseye. And we recognized that we were going to have to deal with that problem. We saw the 7-digit code as potentially feasible, because after all, 7 digits means you've got effectively 10 million code numbers. However, maintaining the code numbers and all of the administrative implications of dealing with that, which means that it had to be administered centrally, was going to be a big issue, and in fact an administrative nightmare. And then finally we said to Mike, I said to Mike, I had to go alone, by the way, but anyway, I said to Mike that there's going to be a need for a parametric model, hopefully not as complex as the New York City parametric model, but a model that basically underpinned the rationale for picking anything and imposing it or suggesting it as an industry-wide standard. So there's where we were at the end of 1970, about 3 months after the project began.